Hello, my name is Grant Lichtman, and for the last decade, I've had the great opportunity and privilege to visit and work with schools all over the United States, Canada, and some around the world as we all try to meet the challenges and find opportunities in a rapidly changing world. And I think we can all agree that in terms of change, 2020 has been a year of massive disruption and change for education. And I'd like to take just these few minutes to share with you some of my observations about the lessons that we've been learning from the pandemic and what that means for our planning and our vision for education in the years to come. I'll share my screen now. Perhaps the biggest lesson is that last spring for all of us, the metaphor might be that an earthquake shook down the house that we'd all built. And we have to ask ourselves the question, are we going to rebuild that house of education, that system of education, the same way it was before? Or are we going to learn from the profound lessons that we've had over the last 7 or 8 months? There's a great saying that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And we have to ask ourselves, are we going to use or waste this crisis and the lessons we learn to build a better education system going forward? Over the last decade or two, I think education has been facing these 3 big existential questions. Why should we change? What's that change going to look like? And how do we go about changing schools? And that's really been the subject of the 3 books I've written in the last 8 years. To a large extent, that question, why should we change, has been asked and answered. Most educators and many community stakeholders around the world recognize that in order to prepare our students for the world that they will inherit and their future, we need to do school differently. The question really is, what is that change going to look like? And there's been tremendous advance and progress and transformation in school systems around the world with respect to that. And this pandemic was like an accelerant, an amplifier of the need to understand how change has to happen in schools and what schools should look like in the future. And then we need to touch on how do we go about doing that? How do you as school leaders, whether you're in the classroom or the administrative suite, how do you go about helping your school to change? Well, on top of those 3 big questions that we've been wrestling with for the last couple of decades, we have this new response to the pandemic, the transition or the transformation that all organizations go through when they enter a period of crisis. Many of us were stuck in respond, or we might call triage mode, through most of the spring and even into the summer. And then some schools started to recover with a plan for what school would look like this fall. Some school systems are still in that respond and triage modality as conditions change on the ground, even as we've started school this year. Eventually, we're all going to get to the point where we move through the respond and recover phases, and we have both the opportunity and the responsibility to reinvent the organization, to take advantage of what we've learned and plan better for the future. I'll be honest, I had calls from schools in March and April of the spring, schools that said, you know what, now's the time for us to accelerate reinvention, to not put the brakes on, but to take advantage of the fact that we've been challenged by this crisis. We've found that we can overcome some of these challenges to really start accelerating this period of reinvention. And you have to figure out where your school is within this framework. Some of the big lessons that we've learned or relearned, or hopefully we'll learn from the pandemic. The first is that education, certainly here in the United States and I think around the world, is fundamentally inequitable. We've known this for decades, and it may be that we still don't learn this lesson for all sorts of reasons related to economics and social systems and poverty. One of the most apparent inequities that came to the forefront last spring was the critical need for virtual technology, so students and teachers can learn and teach from home and not have to come to school every day. And we have vast inequities in that system across our schools. We found that our school systems are actually capable of big change. I'm going to drill down in that a little bit here in a few minutes. We've been so overcome by fear and inertia for generations, but now we know that we can overcome big challenges when they face us. we're learning that the very fundamental nature of how humans interact has been rapidly changing over the last 10 or 20 years. And just the fact that we're speaking with each other, I from San Diego, California, and you from wherever you all are, without getting on an airplane, and we're all able to attend this conference together, is just such a perfect example of what's happened. And now that we all realize this with the pandemic shutdowns. And finally, I think that many more people across the world, across sectors, finally understand what an exponential rate of change means. It's not just about technology, but there's so many elements of our human condition that have been changing exponentially in the last several decades, certainly in the last couple of generations. And with the pandemic and the spread of the virus in the spring, many more people now realize what an exponential rate of change actually means, and the challenges, the extraordinary challenges that puts onto all of us. But let's drill down into a little bit more of some of the big lessons that we've been learning. In the spring, everybody was saying, wow, what's school going to look like in the fall? It's going to look this way or that way. And a lot of us were saying, one size fits all has never worked well for many schools, and it certainly isn't going to work well with respect to this pandemic. And I think that's been proven that this fall, as schools have opened in many parts of the world, every single version that we might have imagined last spring is operating somewhere, and we can watch how that happens. We can see what works and what doesn't work. And we have to take advantage of those opportunities, this petri dish we're in, to see how changing the school operating system can benefit our school communities. We have to understand that this may not be the last time we're shut down. We had schools who thought that they would open in the fall and everything would be fine, everything would be back to normal. Many of those plans were thrown out the window in August or early September. Some schools may be opening and forced to close again. And that may happen over the next 3 months, 6 months, a year. And it may happen not just with respect to this pandemic, but in the future. One of the real lessons is that we have known for decades, science has told us that pandemics like this disruptions like this are inevitable. And yet we did not plan well for this. We did a very poor job of planning. And so we have to plan better for disruptions like this in the future, and we can. We know now that the mantra that we've heard for generations from educators, that changing a school is like turning an aircraft carrier, it was never true. And we know that it's not true now. That myth has been busted. Many schools around the world, overnight or over a weekend or in a period of a week or so, fundamentally changed how they were delivering education to their students. They did it effectively, they did it efficiently. It wasn't equitable. Larger school systems are more difficult to change, have a great deal more inertia and bureaucracy, but we know that changing a school culture is not impossible. Now we've been through that once. We need to apply that in the future and become far more nimble and flexible as we structure what school looks like going forward. We found that there are some elements of pedagogy, of the learning experience, that are actually fabulous, can be done very well in both virtual and hybrid environments. We know that the elements of deeper learning, of student centrism and engagement and inquiry-based learning are the directions that education is taking now and will be taking in the future. And some of those can actually be done quite well in virtual and hybrid environments. We found ways for interactive, personalized, high touch and engaging activities for students, especially the older students who are able to own more of the learning experience themselves. We found that they were able to create their own learning environments, participate in their own learning environments, and it's certainly not something we want to do full time, but some of those lessons we're going to bring back to the face-to-face environment with us, and we're going to be better educators for the experience. And perhaps most importantly, the wellness, the physical, social, emotional wellness of our students, the adults in our communities, those always should have been job number one for educators. And I think for most educators, we would say they are. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of times the attention to wellness has not been deeply embedded in what we do in school. I talked to a lot of teachers who said, I check in more now with my students virtually than I did when we were face-to-face. I'm going to bring that back to the face-to-face environment with me when we return to make sure that we're really deeply embedding attention to wellness for all of our community stakeholders. And so what are some of the major future-focused trends that are really being accelerated by the pandemic and where we can take advantage of opportunities? Well, the first and biggest one, I think, is that education at its core has always been about transferring the knowledge of past generations to the rising generation. And over the last couple of decades, we've seen the evolution of what I've called the cognitosphere, others call the metaverse, this global social neural network that allows us to communicate in ways we never could 20 years ago. And up until about 7 months ago, a lot of educators thought this was science fiction. We could never communicate like we are right now. And yet this has become normal for all of us. And so we are now able to take advantage of transferring, creating and exchanging information in ways we never have before. And that's not going to return back to the norm just because we can go back to a face-to-face learning environment. Many schools had students and teachers who were involved in distance and virtual learning in the past, but schools now are recognizing that this can become a fundamental part of their operating system. We see schools opening up their learning experience to students from all over the world who can log in and participate. This is no longer a niche market or a boutique market. This is something that all schools can be involved in and can be involved in very effectively. We've seen the trend toward personalized and differentiated learning systems so that students are not slave to a curriculum that is speaking to the average student in the class or to a decades-old syllabus, but that they're able to progress much more at their own pace. And we saw that in the virtual environment, that almost de facto we have to let students more set their own pace, take greater ownership of their learning, base assessment on mastery, not just seat time. And we're becoming more comfortable with that, having been through that in the virtual environment. Over the last decade or so, we've seen an explosion of education and learning taking place. I call it in and with the community, where a community is not just a place for a field trip or a service project, but there are fabulous learning opportunities and partners for our students everywhere in the community. And as we got away from this idea that school had to be taking place only on a campus with a high density of students and teachers, we can see a distribution of these learning opportunities across our community. And in so many different ways, schools are starting to take advantage of this in really rich learning experiences. We, of course, are seeing dramatic changes in the use of time and space. We found through the shutdown in the spring, it's not a good thing for students to have to sit and listen and watch, whether it's a teacher or a computer, for 5, 6, 7 hours a day. We saw that some students don't learn best when they get up and start school at 8 o'clock in the morning and finish at 3 in the afternoon, that more flexible pacing is good for them. And that sort of flexibility is going to come back and is going to be a large part of the operating system of schools going forward. And of course, technology is evolving so quickly. Today, we're using a technology, Zoom type technologies, virtual chat technologies that frankly didn't exist even 5 or 6 years ago. If this pandemic had hit 5 or 6 years ago, many, many more students and school systems would have been disenfranchised and would have had to shut down completely. We think 5 years from now of the capabilities of virtual reality and artificial intelligence in addition to these video capabilities, and those are going to be a fundamental part of the school operating system, and they should be, whether or not we are shut down or operating largely face-to-face. So those are some of the major trends that are being accelerated by this pandemic. And you as school leaders, whether you're leading from the classroom, as I said, from the executive suite, from the district level, how are you going to manage that change? At a time when the disruptions are coming at us fast, furious, and we really can't predict the future all that well. I guess I was a little bit fortunate that I published my last book, Thrive, just about a year ago. And it really speaks to what we know about how organizations change well, translated into the specific language of schools. We know that it's a mixture of understanding what our community needs and wants so that we can provide those solutions to them as their conditions change. We know that schools have to provide that strong differentiated value proposition and have their strategies driven by that value proposition so that families will choose to come to your school. And we know a lot about how organizations change efficiently, and we're starting to see more and more schools take advantage of those lessons. At a really sort of 30,000 foot level, many of us have sort of come to agree that the great model of, I call it Kotter Plus, but in reference to John Kotter from Harvard University, one of the real gurus of organizational change, has laid out a very concise roadmap for us of how to take our schools through change, whether it's related to the pandemic, or whether it's just longer term change related to the vision and strategies that you've set out to prepare our students better for the future. We certainly have step one down. We have a moment of urgency, and both urgency and big opportunity. And so that's sort of laid out for us today. And we're then called upon as a community to come together, find our individual North Star, the North Star for our school or our school district, and then begin to act on those aspirations, ultimately resulting in a long-term change in our culture, in the way we implement change, the comfort we have with flexibility, so that we can respond to what's going on in the world around us, that we're not somehow separated from that world. And if I can just try to put that, a core of that into these next two slides of how this relates to us as schools. We know that schools essentially operate on three levels. There's a level that's, I would call it sort of the 30,000 foot level. It's the vision, the mission, and in this case, our North Star. Who is it that we want to be? What are our core values? What do we need to deliver for our students over not a year or two or three, and not in response to a pandemic, but over a longer period of time, over the next 5, 10, 20 years. And then there's a 10,000 foot level, which are those systems that are the operating system of our school that allows us to deliver on our vision. Those elements of the system are pedagogy and instruction and curriculum, the use of time, the use of space, assessment, things like that. And then there's the ground floor that have largely been the purview of the teachers. What do I do with my students every day? And what we have to do is we have to ensure, as we meet these challenges and as we take advantage of new opportunities, we have to ensure that there's alignment across these three levels, or else we really have a very, very difficult road ahead in terms of sustainable change, and I would say ultimately thriving for our schools. And if there's one set of relationships that I think allows this all to hang together, it's this. Every organization has to establish what their winning value proposition is, that reason that students come to us when, frankly, in many districts, many regions, many countries, students have an increasingly large number of choices about where to go to get education. And with the rise of virtual learning, they can access education from all over the world, or all over the world from their home. So we establish those core values, and those values have to lead our long-term strategies. Not the tactics that how we're going to meet a pandemic in the short term, but our long-term strategies over the next 1, 3, 5, 10, and 20 years. Those have to align. And our strategies then have to dictate what are those changes that we're going to select that are truly innovative for us. Because innovation is not about just implementing new ideas or finding a new idea. Innovation is about implementing ideas that are going to add value to the system, in your case, the school, over time. And so this is an inextricable cycle. And if school leaders, from teachers to the board, will understand this and align these three elements together so that they're not haphazard, so they mutually support each other, you have a vastly greater potential to thrive in a time of real evolution and, in fact, revolution and disruption for all of our education systems. People have asked me, is there one characteristic of schools that seem to do these things well, that seem to meet these challenges and take advantage of opportunities, whether it's in face of a pandemic or a much longer period of well thought out strategic change? And I would say that there is, and it's this. Those schools engage well with their community, their customers, their students, their teachers, their administrators, their parents, the community in which they live. And rather than telling their community, this is why we do what we do and this is why it's good for you, they ask questions, they listen, they allow their community to imagine and design. And all of that allows and encourages a community to embrace the acceleration and the possibilities that change brings, rather than being fearful of them. Right now, we're in a moment, many of us are in a moment where we can't deal with any of that. We're just putting up with the effects of the pandemic. But this is going to pass. And as it does pass for each of you in your own time frame, I encourage you to be increasingly involved in these engagement activities so that your school system will thrive over time. It's a pretty easy metaphor to see from the slide. As things change around us, as the world changes around us, as we have new challenges, new opportunities, new inventions, new technologies, are we actually going to, in this case, have the train move faster just by shoveling more coal into the engine? No, there's a reason that most parts of the world don't run on, trains don't run on coal-fired steam engines any longer. Because no matter how much faster you shovel the coal, the train can't go any more quickly. We have to make some fundamental changes in our school system, and the pandemic has given us both opportunity to do that because we are overcoming some of our fears. It's been a huge challenge to us because of the forced changes that it's brought to our school systems. But let's see this as a way to begin to break down the old operating system and leverage and amplify some of what we know is great about learning for the future. And with that, I share all of my resources on my website. There are free downloads for the introductions to my books, articles, videos, etc. Contact information for me. I hope you all have a wonderful conference. We're all fortunate to be able to attend virtually the conference this year. Thanks so much for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you if you'd like to get in touch with me. Thank you very much.